This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 31, Chapter 18, The Spirit of England. 9 times out of 10 a man's broad-mindedness is necessarily the narrowest thing about him. This is not particularly paradoxical. It is, when we come to think of it, quite inevitable. His vision of his own village may really be full of varieties, and even his vision of his own nation may have a rough resemblance to reality. But his vision of the world is probably smaller than the world. His vision of the universe is certainly much smaller than the universe. Hence he is never so inadequate as when he is universal. He is never so limited as when he generalizes. This is the fallacy in the many modern attempts at a creedless creed, as something variously described as essential Christianity, or undenominational religion, or a world faith to embrace all faiths in the world. It is that every sectarian is more sectarian in his unsectarianism than he is in his sect. The emancipation of a Baptist is a very Baptist emancipation. The charity of a Buddhist is a very Buddhist charity, and very different from Christian charity. When a philosopher embraces everything, it generally squeezes everything, and squeezes it out of shape. When it digests, it necessarily assimilates. When a theosophist absorbs Christianity, it is rather as a cannibal absorbs Christian missionaries. In this sense, it is even possible for the larger thing to be swallowed by the smaller, and for men to move about not only in a Clapham sect, but in a Clapham cosmos under Clapham moons and stars. But if this danger exists for all men, it exists especially for the Englishman. The Englishman is never so insular as when he is imperial, except indeed when he is international. In private life he is a good friend, and in practical politics generally a good ally. But theoretical politics are more practical than practical politics, and in theoretical politics the Englishman is the worst ally the world ever saw. This is all the more curious because he has passed so much of his historical life in the character of an ally. He has been in 20 great alliances and never understood one of them. He has never been farther away from European politics than when he was fighting heroically in the thick of them. I myself think that this splendid isolation is sometimes really splendid, so long as it is isolation and does not imagine itself to be imperialism or internationalism. With the idea of being international, with the idea of being imperial, comes the frantic and farcical idea of being impartial. Generally speaking, men are never so mean and false and hypocritical as when they are occupied in being impartial. They are performing the first and most typical of all the actions of the devil. They are claiming the throne of God. Even when it is not hypocrisy, but only mental confusion, it is always a confusion worse and worse confounded. We see it in the impartial historians of the Victorian age, who now seem far more Victorian than the partial historians. Hallam wrote about the Middle Ages, but Hallam was far less medieval than Macaulay, for Macaulay was at least a fighter. Huxley had more medieval sympathies than Herbert Spencer for the same reason, that Huxley was a fighter. They both fought in many ways for the limitations of their own rationalistic epic, but they were nearer the truth than the men who simply assumed those limitations as rational. The war of the controversialists was a wider thing than the peace of the arbiters. And in the same way the Englishman never cuts a less convincing figure before other nations than when he tries to arbitrate between them. I have by this time heard a great deal about the necessity of saving Anglo-American friendship, a necessity which I myself feel rather too strongly to be satisfied with the ambassadorial and editorial style of achieving it. I have already said that the worst style of all is to be Anglo-American. or, as the more illiterate would express it, to be Anglo-Saxon. I am more and more convinced that the way for the Englishman to do it is to be English, but to know that he is English, and not everything else as well. Thus the only sincere answer to Irish nationalism is English nationalism, which is a reality, and not English imperialism, which is a reactionary fiction, or English internationalism, which is a revolutionary one. For the English are reviled for their imperialism because they are not imperialistic. They dislike it, which is the real reason why they do it badly. And they do it badly, which is the real reason why they are disliked when they do it. Nobody calls France imperialistic because she has absorbed Brittany. But everybody calls England imperialistic because she has not absorbed Ireland. The Englishman is fixed and frozen forever in the attitude of a ruthless conqueror, not because he has conquered such people, but because he has not conquered them. But he is always trying to conquer them with a heroism worthy of a better cause. For the really native and vigorous part of what is unfortunately called the British Empire is not an empire at all, and does not consist of these conquered provinces at all. It is not an empire, but an adventure, which is probably a much finer thing. It was not the power of making strange countries similar to our own, but simply the pleasure of seeing strange countries because they were different from our own. The adventurer did indeed, like the third son, set out to seek his fortune, but not primarily to alter other people's fortunes. He wished to trade with people rather than to rule them. But as the other people remained different from him, so did he remain different from them. The adventurer saw 1,000 strange things and remained a stranger. He was the Robinson Crusoe on 100 desert islands, and on each he remained as insular as on his own island. What is wanted for the cause of England today is an Englishman with enough imagination to love his country from the outside as well as the inside. That is, we need somebody who will do for the English what has never been done for them, but what is done for any outlandish peasantry or even any savage tribe. We want people who can make England attractive, quite apart from disputes about whether England is strong or weak. We want somebody to explain, not that England is everywhere, but what England is anywhere. Not that England is or is not really dying, but why we do not want her to die. For this purpose, the official and conventional compliments or claims can never get any further than pompous abstractions about law and justice and truth, the ideals which England accepts as every civilized state accepts them, and violates as every civilized state violates them. That is not the way in which the picture of any people has ever been painted on the sympathetic imagination of the world. Enthusiasts for old Japan did not tell us that the Japs recognized the existence of abstract morality, but that they lived in paper houses or wrote letters with paintbrushes. Men who wished to interest us in Arabs did not confine themselves to saying that they are monotheists or moralists. They filled our romances with the rush of Arab steeds or the colours of strange tents or carpets. What we want is somebody who will do for the Englishman with his front garden what was done for the Japanese and his paper house, who shall understand the Englishman with his dog as well as the Arab with his horse. In a word, what nobody has really tried to do is the one thing that really wants doing. It is to make England attractive as a nationality, and even as a small nationality. For it is a wild folly to suppose that nations will love each other because they are alike. They will never really do that unless they are really alike, and then they will not be nations. Nations can love each other as men and women love each other, not because they are alike, but because they are different. It can easily be shown, I fancy, that in every case where a real public sympathy was aroused for some unfortunate foreign people, it has always been accompanied with a particular and positive interest in their most foreign customs and their most foreign externals. The man who made a romance of the Scotch Highlander made a romance of his kilt and even of his dirk. The friend of the Red Indians was interested in picture writing, and had some tendency to be interested in scalping. To take a more serious example, such nations as Serbia had been largely commended to international consideration by the study of Serbian epics or Serbian songs. The epic of Negro emancipation was also the epic of Negro melodies. Those who wept over Uncle Tom also laughed over Uncle Remus. And just as the admiration for the Red Indian almost became an apology for scalping, the mysterious fascination of the African has sometimes almost led us into the fringes of the Black Forest of voodoo. But the sort of interest that is felt even in the scalp hunter and the cannibal, the torturer and the devil worshipper, that sort of interest has never been felt in the Englishman. And this is the more extraordinary because the Englishman is really very interesting. He is interesting in a special degree in this special manner. He is interesting because he is individual. No man in the world is more misrepresented by everything official, or even in the ordinary sense national. A description of English life must be a description of private life. In that sense there is no public life. In that sense there is no public opinion. There have never been those prairie fires of public opinion in England which often sweep over America. At any rate, there have never been any such popular revolutions since the popular revolutions of the Middle Ages. The English are a nation of amateurs. They are even a nation of eccentrics. An Englishman is never more English than when he is considered a lunatic by the other Englishmen. This can be clearly seen in a figure like Dr. Johnson, who has become national not by being normal, but by being extraordinary. To express this mysterious people, to explain or suggest why they like tall hedges and heavy breakfasts and crooked roads and small gardens with large fences, and why they alone among Christians have kept quite consistently the great Christian glory of the open fireplace. Here would be a strange and stimulating opportunity for any of the artists in words who study the souls of strange peoples. That would be the true way to create a friendship between England and America, or between England and anything else. Yes, even between England and Ireland. For this justice at least has already been done to Ireland, and as an indignant patriot I demand a more equal treatment for the two nations. I have already noted the commonplace that in order to teach internationalism we must talk nationalism. We must make the nations, as nations, less odious or mysterious to each other. We do not make men love each other by describing a monster with 1,000,000 arms and legs, but by describing the men as men with their separate and even solitary emotions. As this has a particular application to the emotions of an Englishman, I will return to the topic once more. Now Americans have a power that is the soul and success of democracy, the power of spontaneous social organization. Their high spirits, their humane ideals are really creative. They abound in unofficial institutions. We might almost say in unofficial officialism. Nobody who has ever felt the presence of all the leagues and guilds and colleges and clubs will deny that Whitman was a national when he said he would build states and cities out of the love of comrades. When all this communal enthusiasm collides with the Englishman, it too often seems literally to leave him cold. They say he is reserved. They possibly think he is rude. And the Englishman, having been taught his own history all wrong, is only too likely to take the criticism as a compliment. He admits that he is reserved because he is stern and strong, or even that he is rude because he is shrewd and candid. But as a fact he is not rude, and not especially reserved. At least reserve is not the meaning of his reluctance. The real difference lies, I think, in the fact that American high spirits are not only high but level, that the hilarious American spirit is like a plateau, and the humorous English spirit like a ragged mountain range. The Englishman is moody, which does not in the least mean that the Englishman is morose. Dickens, as we all feel in reading his books, is boisterously English. Dickens was moody when he wrote Oliver Twist, but he was also moody when he wrote Pickwick. That is, he was in another and much healthier mood. The mood was normal to him in the sense that 9 times out of 10 he felt and wrote in that humorous and hilarious mood. But he was, if ever there was one, a man of moods, and all the more of a typical Englishman for being a man of moods. But it was because of this, almost entirely, that he had a misunderstanding with America. In America there are no moods, or there is only one mood. It is the same whether it is called hustle or uplift, or whether we regard it as the heroic love of comrades or the last hysteria of the herd instinct. It has been said of the typical English aristocrats of the government offices that they resemble certain ornamental fountains and play from 10 till 4. And it is true that an Englishman, even an English aristocrat, is not always inclined to play any more than to work. But American sociability is not like the Trafalgar fountains. It is like Niagara. It never stops. Under the silent stars or the rolling storms, there seems always to be the same human heat and pressure behind it. It is like the central heating of hotels, as explained in the advertisements and announcements. The temperature can be regulated, but it is not, and it is always rather overpowering for an Englishman, whose mood changes like his own mutable and shifting sky. The English mood is very like the English weather. It is a nuisance and a national necessity. If anyone wishes to understand the quarrel between Dickens and the Americans, let him turn to that chapter in Martin Chuzzlewit, in which young Martin has to receive endless defiles and deputations of total strangers, each announced by name and demanding formal salutation. There are several things to be noticed about this incident. To begin with, it did not happen to Martin Chuzzlewit, but it did happen to Charles Dickens. Dickens is incorporating almost without alteration a passage from a diary in the middle of a story, as he did when he included the admirable account of the prison petition of John Dickens as the prison petition of Wilkins Micawber. There is no particular reason why even the gregarious Americans should so throng the portals of a perfectly obscure steerage passenger like young Chuzzlewit. There was every reason why they should throng the portals of the author of Pickwick and Oliver Twist. And no doubt they did. If I may be permitted the aleatory image, you bet they did. Similar troops of sociable human beings have visited much more insignificant English travellers in America, with some of whom I am myself acquainted. I myself have the luck to be a little more stodgy and less sensitive than many of our countrymen, and certainly less sensitive than Dickens. But I know what it was that annoyed him about that unending and unchanging stream of American visitors. It was the unending and unchanging stream of American sociability and high spirits. A people living on such a lofty but level tableland do not understand the ups and downs of the English temperament, the temper of a nation of eccentrics, or, as they used to be called, of humorists. There is something very national in the very name of the old play of every man in his humour, but the play more often acted in real life is every man out of his humour. It is true that, as Matthew Arnold said, that an Englishman wants to do as he likes, but it is not always true even that he likes what he likes. An Englishman can be friendly and yet not feel friendly, or he can be friendly and yet not feel hospitable, or he can feel hospitable and yet not welcome those whom he really loves. He can think almost with tears of tenderness about people at a distance who would be bores if they came in at the door. American sociability sweeps away any such subtlety. It cannot be expected to understand the paradox or perversity of the Englishman, who thus can feel friendly and avoid friends. That is the truth in the suggestion that Dickens was sentimental. It means that he probably felt most sociable when he was solitary. In all those attempts to describe the indescribable, to indicate the real but unconscious differences between the two peoples, I have tried to balance my words without the irrelevant bias of praise and blame. Both characteristics always cut both ways. On one side, this comradeship makes possible a certain communal courage, a democratic derision of rich men in high places, that is not easy in our smaller and more stratified society. On the other hand, the Englishman has certainly more liberty, if less equality and fraternity. But the richest compensation of the Englishman is not even in the word liberty, but rather in the word poetry, that humour of escape or seclusion, that genial isolation, that healing of wounded friendship by what Christian Science would call absent treatment, that is the best atmosphere of all for the creation of great poetry. And out of that came bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang, and thou wast not made for death, immortal bird. In this sense it is indeed true that poetry is emotion remembered in tranquillity, which may be extended to mean affection remembered in loneliness. There is in it a spirit not only of detachment but even of distance, a spirit which does desire, as in the old English rhyme, to be not only over the hills but also far away. In other words, in so far as it is true that the Englishman is an exception to the great truth of Aristotle, it is because he is not so near to Aristotle as he is to Homer. In so far as he is not by nature a political animal, it is because he is a poetical animal. We see it in his relations to the other animals, his quaint and almost illogical love of dogs and horses and dependents whose political rights cannot possibly be defined in logic. Many forms of hunting or fishing are but an excuse for the same thing which the shameless literary man does without any excuse. Sport is speechless poetry. It would be easy for a foreigner, by taking a few liberties with the facts, to make a satire about the sort of silent Shelley who decides ultimately to shoot the skylark. It would be easy to answer these poetic suggestions by saying that he himself might be responsible for ruining the choirs where late the sweet birds sang, or that the immortal bird was likely to be mortal when he was out with his gun. But these international satires are never just, and the real relations of an Englishman and an English bird are far more delicate. It would be equally easy and equally unjust to suggest a similar satire against American democracy, and represent Americans merely as birds of a feather who can do nothing but flock together. But this would leave out the fact that at least it is not the white feather, that democracy is capable of defiance and of death for an idea. Touching the souls of great nations, these criticisms are generally false because they are critical. But when we are quite sure that we rejoice in a nation's strength, then and not before, we are justified in judging its weaknesses. I am quite sure that I rejoice in any democratic success without arrière-pensée, and nobody who knows me will credit me with a covert sneer at civic equality. And this being granted, I do not think there is a danger in the gregariousness of American society. The danger of democracy is not anarchy. On the contrary, it is monotony. And it is touching this that all my experience has increased my conviction that a great deal that is called female emancipation has merely been the increase of female convention. Now, the males of every community are far too conventional. It was the females who were individual. There is a danger of individuality being lost. This, indeed, is not peculiar to America. It is common to the whole modern industrial world, and to everything which substitutes the impersonal atmosphere of the state for the personal atmosphere of the home. But it is emphasized in America by the curious contradiction that Americans do in theory value and even venerate the individual. But individualism is still the foe of individuality. Where men are trying to compete with each other, they are trying to copy each other. They become featureless by featuring the same part. Personality, in becoming a conscious ideal, becomes a common ideal. In this respect, perhaps, there is really something to be learnt from the Englishman with his turn or twist in the direction of private life. Those who have travelled in such a fashion as to see all the American hotels and none of the American houses are sometimes driven to the excess of saying that the Americans have no private life. But even if the exaggeration has a hint of truth, we must balance it with the corresponding truth that the English have no public life. They, on their side, have still to learn the meaning of the public thing, the republic, and how great are the dangers of cowardice and corruption when the very state itself has become a state secret. The English are patriotic, But patriotism is the unconscious form of nationalism. It is being national without understanding the meaning of a nation. The Americans are on the whole too self-conscious, kept moving too much in the pace of public life, with all its temptations to superficiality and fashion, and too much aware of outside opinion, and with too much appetite for outside criticism. But the English are much too unconscious, and would be the better for an increase in many forms of consciousness, including consciousness of sin. But even their sin is ignorance of their real virtue. The most admirable English things are not the things that are most admired by the English, or for which the English admire themselves. They are things now blindly neglected and in daily danger of being destroyed. It is all the worse that they should be destroyed, because there is really nothing like them in the world. That is why I have suggested a note of nationalism rather than patriotism for the English. The power of seeing their nation as a nation and not as a nature of things. We say of some ballad from the Balkans or some peasant costume in the Netherlands that it is unique. But the good things of England really are unique. Our very isolation from continental wars and revolutionary reconstructions have kept them unique. The particular kind of beauty there is in an English village, the particular kind of humour there is in an English public house, are things that cannot be found in lands where the village is far more simply and equally governed, or where the vine is far more honourably served and praised. Yet we shall not save them by merely sinking into them with the conservative sort of contentment, even if the commercial rapacity of our plutocratic reforms would allow us to do so. We must, in a sense, get far away from England in order to behold her. We must rise above patriotism in order to be practically patriotic. We must have some sense of more varied and remote things before these vanishing virtues can be seen suddenly for what they are. Almost as one might fancy that a man would have to rise to the dizziest heights of the divine understanding before he saw, as from a peak far above a whirlpool, how precious is his perishing soul. The end of chapter 18, section 31.